G'day guys, Ryan Pickles here again, and on this episode of Pickels Pickles, I'm going to be moving away from fermenting and showing you a different way to preserve food by dehydrating beef into beef jerky. Now, as much as we all love beef jerky, it can be bloody expensive if you buy it at the supermarket. And as tasty as it is, sometimes it's hard to justify a price of $90 per kilo. But the good news is that if you've got a bit of time up your sleeve, you can actually make some great beef jerky at home for almost a third of the price. So we'll start with our beef. You want a lean cut of meat, something like the round, the flank, or the top side. I like to buy my meat from a butcher because they can trim the fat off for you, and they can also give you some advice on what type of meat to buy if you're not too sure. The reason you want lean meat without a lot of fat is that lean meat dehydrates really well, but if there's a lot of fat in there, it tends to spoil and go rancid much quicker. So I've got almost 2 kilos of topside beef here, and to make it into jerky, we're going to have to cut it into slices. Now, to get the best results, you want those slices as thin as you can, because it'll take up more of the marinade, so it'll taste nicer, plus they'll dehydrate faster. I actually like to put my meat in the freezer first for about an hour, because when the meat's slightly frozen, it's going to be a lot easier to cut into nice, thin, consistent slices. So I'll cut my beef into smaller pieces just to make it easier to slice. And then I'll pop it in the freezer for about an hour. So now that the meat's slightly frozen, you want to cut it as thin as you can. I like cutting against the grain, so if the lines of the meat are running like this, I'll make my cuts perpendicular to that in this direction. Some places recommend cutting with the grain. Now that has the benefit of helping the meat stay together, but it also tends to be chewier and not as tender. Now you want your slices to be as thin as you can. Any more than ½ centimetre is probably too thick. And it's best to cut your slices at a consistent width, otherwise they're going to be dehydrating at different speeds. Now sometimes if you tell your butcher you're making jerky, they'll slice the meat for you. The last time I did that, he sliced it way too thick and it actually took ages to dehydrate. So now I just like to slice it myself. So now you've sliced your beef, it's time to marinate it. Marinating does 2 things. Firstly, it tenderises the meat, which is pretty important if you don't want to end up with rock hard bits of jerky. It's also what turns your chewy hunk of protein into something that actually tastes decent. And there are limitless options for marinades out there, but I'm going to show you a couple of my favourites. The first one's a classic Smoky BBQ flavour, so for every kilo of beef, I'll use the following ingredients. A 1/4 cup of soy sauce. Now I like to make up about half of that with normal soy sauce, and the other half with dark soy sauce, which is a bit thicker, has a richer flavour, and is quite nice for a marinade. Then you want 2 tablespoons of Worcestershire sauce, 2 tablespoons of brown sugar, 2 teaspoons of salt, about a teaspoon of black pepper, and then a teaspoon each of garlic powder, onion powder, smoked paprika, meat tenderising powder, and then smoke powder or liquid smoke to add a nice smoky flavour. Now if you want to make it spicy, feel free to add some chili powder or hot sauce. Now I'm going to use my Blair's Mega Death sauce with liquid rage, which is a weapons grade hot sauce which really doesn't have any business being sold for human consumption. Now I found a couple of dabs of this in the marinades, enough to set your mouth on fire, and I actually want people to enjoy this jerky, so I'm just going to use a small one. And just to make things interesting while I stir the marinade, I thought I'd do it under the influence of a hot sauce that rates 550,000 on the Scoville scale. Oh yeah, that's enough. All right, bottoms up. So mix the marinade together until it forms a nice liquid. Oh Jesus. Whew. Oh, this is a mistake. Oh boy. And we'll take half our meat and add it to the marinade. And we'll toss the marinade together. So we're coating all of our... Oh, why did I do this? Now, a very important thing while you're doing this is to try to ignore the burning sensation that's coming from your mouth all the way down your esophagus into your stomach. Oh, Jesus. All right, provided you're still alive at this point, put the meat into a container. Oh boy. I like to cover it with a bit of cling wrap and put it in the fridge along with this where it belongs. Alright, so I can still kind of feel the sauce trying to burn a hole through the lining of my stomach, but while that happens, we're going to make our next marinade. So the next marinade I use is an Asian style flavour. It's kind of like a modified bulgogi marinade. So for this one I'm going to use half a cup of soy sauce, and just like before, I'll use a mix of normal and dark. Then add a 1/4 cup of rice wine, 2 tablespoons of brown sugar, 2 teaspoons of garlic powder, 2 teaspoons of sesame seeds, a teaspoon of meat tenderiser powder, and a good teaspoon of ginger. You can either grate it fresh like this, or you can use a powder. Then add 2 teaspoons of sesame oil, about half a teaspoon of salt. Then I add a couple of teaspoons of gochugaru, which is a Korean red chili powder. If you don't have this, I'd use smoked paprika instead. Then we'll mix our marinade together, add our meat, and we'll toss it through. And again, once we've marinated our meat, just pop it into a container and put it in the fridge. And I'll give the meat as much time as possible to marinate. I'll come back tomorrow and it should be ready to dehydrate. So now that the meat's been marinated, it helps to get the slices as thin as you possibly can before dehydrating them. So I like to put the slices between 2 pieces of cling wrap so we don't make a mess. Then use the flat side of a meat tenderiser to smash them even thinner. And that just helps to give us really thin slices like this. And we'll do this for all the slices before we start dehydrating them. Now there are a number of different ways to dehydrate your jerky. I'm lucky enough to have a food dehydrator, which I picked up for about $50, and it's a super easy way to dehydrate your beef. But since one of the main reasons you're making your own jerky is to save money, you can also use your oven if you don't want to buy a whole new piece of equipment. I've never actually used the oven before, but just for you guys, I'm going to give it a go. If you're using a dehydrator, all you have to do is line the trays with your beef, and with the Asian marinade, I like to sprinkle some more sesame seeds on the beef slices before we dry them. And then just turn on the dehydrator to the meat setting, which in this case is 68 degrees, and wait. The dehydrator works by circulating hot air through the layers of beef, and over the next few hours, that's going to evaporate and remove most of the moisture from our slices. That process is what allows the jerky to be stored at room temperature, because any bacteria or mold that could potentially spoil your meat rely on water to grow. So if you've got a dry piece of meat without any available moisture, you'll be able to store it for much longer. The amount of time it takes to dry your jerky really depends on how thin the slices are. If they're nice and thin, there's plenty of surface area from which to evaporate the moisture, so it might only take about 4 to 6 hours. But if the slices are thicker, there's a lot more moisture sitting in the middle that needs to be evaporated, so it could take 8 hours or more. It's a good idea to check it after 3 hours because that'll give you an idea about how much longer you might need to keep going. And it's also a good idea to swap around the order of the racks so that the jerky dries evenly. So after 6 hours, you can see that the jerky is nice and dry. A good rule of thumb is that when it's done, it really shouldn't fold too easily, and you definitely shouldn't be feeling very much moisture inside the jerky. Alright, now let's give the oven method a go. Now again, this is the first time I'm doing this, so I don't know why you're even listening to what I say at this point. So we'll take out the oven racks and preheat the oven to about 65 degrees. I'm going to use the fan setting because I figure that'll help circulate the air a bit better. Next I'm going to line a tray with aluminium foil to catch any marinade dripping from the jerky. Then I'll put an oven rack over the sink. Then put a toothpick through each slice of meat and suspend it from the rack. And then put it in the oven, along with the tray underneath. And then prop the door open with a wooden spoon to let the moisture escape. Well, it's a good thing I checked the jerky after 3 hours in the oven because it's actually dried out heaps already. And as you can see, when I give it a fold, it's nice and dry in the middle as well. So then we'll just take out all the toothpicks and let it cool to room temperature. So once your jerky is done, let it cool down to room temperature and then pat it dry with paper towels. Remember, when it comes to jerky, moisture is the enemy. So the more moisture you have left on your jerky, the more likely it is to grow bacteria or get moldy. And when it comes to storage, the same concept applies. Keep it cool, keep it dry, and keep it in an airtight container. It's a good idea to separate the jerky into Ziploc bags. If you use a container, just be aware that it'll be prone to condensation, so make sure you put a paper towel at the bottom of the container, or even put multiple paper towels in between layers of jerky to make sure you absorb all of the moisture that might accumulate. I also like putting these little silica packets in the containers just to help absorb the moisture. If you store it well, jerky at room temperature can keep for up to a month if you're lucky. Store it in the fridge and it can last up to 6 months, and in the freezer up to a year. So there you have it, we've just made 800 grams of jerky with only $30 worth of beef. It's a great high protein snack and it's perfect to bring along on hikes and road trips. It also makes a pretty awesome gift. Oh yeah, that tastes awesome. If you're anything like me, you'll burn through this way before it goes bad. Well, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more videos as they come out, and leave a comment below to let me know what you want to see me make next. And as always, I'll see you next time on Pickles Pickles.